The War of 1812, often called the Second War of Independence, is a fiercely underappreciated event in our nation's history. The impact and the ramifications prevented from this war are truly remarkable. The acts of foreign powers as well as the political landscape led a peaceful America into a war that was more than it could chew. On land, a series of revealing but expectable defeats were handed to the Americans, with some redemption in the later parts of the war. At sea, however, America showed herself to be quite capable, with single-ship missions wreaking havoc on British shipping lanes. The war concluded with all lands being returned to their pre-war owners. Coming out of this war, America proved its capability on the world stage, but it also learned its weaknesses and how to grow out of them. Additionally, America was rid of many Indian people who were British allies whose lands American settlers had coveted for decades. To most Americans, according to President Madison, their chief issue with Britain was impressment. He wrote an agreement with the so-called War Hawks faction in the House of Representatives when he addressed Congress in his war message. Quote, "We behold and find on the side of Great Britain a state of war against the United States, and on the side of the United States a state of peace towards Great Britain." He left the decision, rightly, to Congress to declare war, but advised explicitly for war against Great Britain. In response, New York Senator Obadiah German said, quote, "It would be bad policy for this country at the present time to enter into war with Great Britain, although perhaps many weighty reasons may be adduced in support of such argument." End quote. His speech continued in a similar fashion, and his opinion, which he was not alone in, was that the war was just, but it was not the time to fight it. Quote, "We cannot, therefore, expect that this little fleet, if it may be so called, can be competent to hold in check any detachment that Great Britain is able to send." Senator German's arguments may have convinced some of his colleagues, but the Senate voted for war on June 18, 1812, 19-13. The commencement of the war led to a mosaic of defeats. The first conflict of the war was at the northern tip of Michigan, where the British captured Fort Mackinac on July 17th. August 15th saw the British capture Fort Dearborn at the present site of Chicago, and just a day later, William Hull surrendered 2,500 troops without firing a shot to Isaac Brock and Tecumseh, who commanded only 730 Canadians and 600 Indians, respectively. In early October, American Major General Stephen von Rensselaer mounted an attack over the Niagara River with 900 regulars and 2,270 militia. However, when he crossed the border, his militia refused to follow him. With only a third of his force with him, he was eviscerated by Brock, with all of his regulars and some few hundred militia that joined the battle either killed or captured. The first year of the war painted a bleak picture of what the Americans had ahead of them, and it seemed that they were even more outclassed in the naval sector, with only 14 seaworthy vessels to 1,048 ships in the British Navy. However, as mentioned before, the performance of the American Navy was a welcome surprise to the States. In 1812 alone, the British had decisively lost 4 naval engagements, all were one-on-one action, and 1 0. Quote, "Ship for ship and crew for crew, the superiority of American design, seamanship, and gunnery was proven. Even with these notable exhibitions of prowess, the quantity of the British Navy could not be ignored. Nearly 100 ships, 11 were ships of the line, 34 were frigates, and the remainder were sloops or smaller, dotted the American seaboard, blockading the nation. From 1813 onward, the U.S. employed a policy of commerce destruction, commissioning privateers to run the blockade and venture the high seas in search of British booty. American privateers sailed all over the earth, capturing exponential numbers compared to the number of privateers of British merchantmen, trading ships, and whalers. Significant ships were the USS Essex, which claimed 40 ships, and the sloop USS Wasp, which claimed 2 British warships and 13 merchantmen right in the English Channel before disappearing mysteriously into the sea. During the year of 1813, it was a war between forts along the Canadian border. That year, the Americans won several needed victories, most under the command of John Brown and William Harrison, but it was still a ferocious back-and-forth war. Uniquely, the war featured close cooperation between land and naval forces due to the network of lakes and rivers that connect Canada to the United States. In the South, the Creek Indians had allied themselves to the British and subsequently massacred the garrison at Fort Mims near Mobile, Alabama. Tennessee Major General Andrew Jackson gathered a force of volunteers and twice over punished the Indians for what they had done. First on November 3, 1813, and again on November 9th. However, he briefly disbanded his force, and they once again became a serious menace. In February, he reformed an army and took the fight to the Creeks. March 27, 1814, Jackson defeated the main Creek force, 900 with his overwhelming army of 2,000. After ending the Creek War, Jackson was commissioned into the regular army and put in command of the Gulf Coast area. In November, against general orders, Jackson retaliated against a British attack that was launched from neutral Spanish-held Pensacola and captured the base. In the final year of the war, the British planned 3 would-be fatal attacks, one each from the north, east, and south. The most memorable attack was from the east. On August 24, 1814, a failed defense saw Washington fall to a British army that had just landed a few weeks earlier. Washington was victim to the British, who burned the Capitol, the White House, and by some sources, various other public and private buildings. This was done in retaliation for the burning of a Canadian town earlier that year. The trauma of this event was great, but the British attack fizzled out when they re-embarked and failed in their attempt to capture Baltimore and Fort McHenry. The Battle of Fort McHenry was well known because it's what inspired Francis Scott Key to compose the Star-Spangled Banner. In the north, the British would launch their most existentially threatening attack, both over the Niagara River and down the Hudson. This attack was aimed at the economic heartland of America, the New York City area. At the Battle of Chippewa, the Niagara front came to a head. General Phineas Riall, with 1,700 regulars, faced off against John Brown's force of 2,200 militia and Indians and 1,300 regulars that was in the process of invading Canada. Riall had turned Brown's left flank when they ran into the American regulars who were late on arriving to the field. Scott's brigade, the regulars, gave the British what for, at a distance of 70 yards. It was regular against regular, and the British broke. This is what evoked the famous quote, "These are regulars, by God," from the British commander. Additionally, this is the battle commemorated by the uniforms of the Military Academy West Point because Scott's brigade could not come up with blue cloth and wore gray instead. Brown's attack into Canada was later halted by further British actions. At the northeastern side of New York, another British attack was coming. Sir George Prevost led 14,000 Peninsular veterans down the Hudson River, along with an accompanying fleet. The only opposition between the British and New York was one fort and an American squadron of ships. On September 11th, 1814, yes, September 11th, Prevost made a combined attack with his forces on land, cooperating with his squadron to take the coastal fort. The decisive action was to be on the water at Lake Champlain. The British had built 4 ships and 12 galleys, and coincidentally, the Americans had built the same amount of ships and galleys. The battle on the lake lasted 2 hours, and a British veteran of the Battle of Trafalgar said it was child's play compared to Lake Champlain. The Americans won the day, and Prevost decided that without command of the lake, his invasion would not be viable, and thus withdrew. This was the decisive action of the war, and after the Battle of Lake Champlain, the threat to the American North was eliminated. However, there was one more invasion coming from the British. In November, Jackson heard rumors of a British invasion of New Orleans, and moved there quickly with his army to set up his defenses. He arrived on December 1st and immediately started preparing for the British attack. 12 days later, the British arrived. There were skirmishes back and forth, but no decisive battle was fought for several weeks. Unbeknownst to the soldiers on the field, a peace deal had been signed on Christmas Eve, but the war wasn't over for them. January 8th, 1815, the British attacked. Jackson's riflemen didn't flinch at their attackers as they killed 2,100 and captured 500. Pakenham was killed along with 2 of his senior officers. It was an utter defeat and an insulting one, as the Americans lost only 11 men in the entire battle. It has been said that peace was had, and then victory. The peace dictated a status quo antebellum, but Britain was forced to end its abuse of American sailors. Additionally, America had the benefit of eliminating many of their Indian enemies and clearing land for her settlers. And while not as visible as those benefits, facing such a challenge as the War of 1812 gave confidence to America, as well as knowledge on what she needed to change. The war showed fatal flaws to the American system of war, largely products of Jefferson's policies. The Navy was too small and relied on privateers to do its business. The Federal Army was a complete joke. The spirited Americans, as always, made for great soldiers, but there were simply not enough of them in the Army. Throughout the war, America relied mainly on poorly trained state militia, which sometimes even refused to fight. The decentralized nature of this military led it to be fairly decent in defense, but completely incapable of launching an attack. American attempts of aggression resembled a raccoon flailing in a trash bin, because generals were, for the most part, in lack of any central plan of attack. They formed their own armies, Brown, Jackson, Harrison, for example, planned and made their own attacks independently, which led to some minor gains and many substantial losses of American life. In contrast, the British are seen with a thorough, albeit flawed, plan to split America into thirds. The British may have been too centralized in the sense that officers, especially naval officers, were punished severely for not following a doctrine to a T. But unlike the Americans, their generals were readily supplied with men, plans, and directives. If America had made way for a more centralized military years before the war and had more coordinated plans instead of random independent attacks, it may be theorized that the war may have ended and began with a much more favorable outcome for the Americans.